Hey everybody, welcome. Alrighty, ready to start Module 5. So again, this is Peer Scholar Week, and so as a result, we are just covering one chapter of the textbook. I'm giving you guys time to focus on the Peer Scholar activity for this week. So the chapter we're focusing on is Chapter 7, mostly on Sigmund Freud, but we're going to actually do 3 lectures, as I now figured. Lecture 1, Sigmund Freud. Lecture 2 will be on a couple of characters, Anna Freud and Karen Horney. You'll learn about them and sort of where they took Freud's theories a little bit. And then we will end with a third video that's just going to be on Carl Jung. So that's the way we'll carve it up. That middle one will be pretty short. This one could be a slightly longer one, and maybe the Jung one will be a little longer as well. Let's do it. Lecture 5. Okay, so this is my PowerPoint. I don't know. Here. Pretty. Yeah. This was a new PowerPoint background. I had to try it. So I don't know why the opening flower seemed Sigmund Freudian to me at some sort, but there we have it. Okay, now that we've had our fun with flowers, let's move on. There we go. Sigmund Freud. All right. Wow. Talk about a force of change. Okay, before we really think about Freud himself, I want you to get your minds back to where we were before Freud. And the story I've been telling you so far, has been one where characters like Pythagoras and Newton have loomed large in the shadows, in the sense that early people trying to study the mind were trying very hard to do so in as scientific a manner as possible. And often that meant trying to describe things via mathematical functions or mathematical formulas, and they were very much interested in sort of the inner mind for the most part. Nobody that I talked about so far was at all interested in what we would now call mental health issues. Kind of think about that for a second. Everybody was just trying to understand how the average, normal, reasonably functioning mind worked, and that had been the focus, and it was really Sigmund who changed that, and we'll be highlighting that. So clinical psychology is what it is because of Sigmund Freud. Before this there was no clinical psychology, and so to some extent we've talked about how the zeitgeists have changed, paradigm shifts. Freud won't really be a paradigm shift. I mean, yes and no. It's more of a paradigm split. When we get to Freud, now we're really going to get a split between the more empirical, the more experimental, scientifically minded psychologists, and the more clinically minded psychologists. Kind of like they go two separate ways, and for a while they do. I'm glad to report they've kind of come back together in the present, and in fact one of the reasons we have a clinical program at University of Toronto Scarborough was University of Toronto's admission that clinical psychology had become scientific enough that we considered it an academic area of study that would fit within the psychology department at U of T. So let's talk about that split, and it begins because largely Sigmund Freud began in a very different way. A lot of the other people we talked to were like physiologists, philosophers, etc. Freud was a doctor of medicine, and he really approached the mind almost as a doctor would. You get a bit of history in the textbook, which basically says he worked with some famous people like Charcot. Pinel is famous for, I'm going to get this wrong, and somebody listening is French, and let me apologize ahead of time, but Salpêtrier what was a place for, they called them at the time, insane asylums. So literally anybody having schizophrenia or any sort of significant mental health issue where they were a danger to themselves or others were put in an institution. And so Salpêtrier was one of those institutions. And Pinel was famous because prior to Pinel, they literally chained people to walls, tied them down to beds. People were running around naked, screaming, and they were all kept together in one place. Every now and then you might have heard people use the word bedlam. They'll say, this place is bedlam, meaning it's just crazy. Bedlam was another insane asylum. So we got that word from an insane asylum, and from the way things kind of happened. And so when Pinnell came in, he thought this was wrong. And he started doing things like getting the patients to help with the landscaping of the institution, to trim hedges, to paint things. So he found jobs and work for them to do. And what he found is the more you treated them like a human being, and the more you gave them tasks and gave them responsibility and allowed them to find some value in their life, the better their symptomology became. And so he was really the father of a much more humane approach to mental health. And this institution itself was the birthplace of that much more humane approach. So it became very famous. It was a place where a lot of people would go, and at some point Freud went there. He was especially interested in this odd condition called hysteria. They called it hysteria at the time. And hysteria refers to situations where somebody has what looks like a neurological disorder, but there seems to be no evidence for it. So let's just talk about one of these and be a little more clear. So this glove is meant to remind you of something that they call glove anesthesia. And basically what it implies is that some people would literally feel like their whole hand, they couldn't feel anything, they can't move it, it's like it's totally anesthetized, it's useless to them. And they act like that. You try to get them to hold something and they don't hold anything, right? Nothing, they can't use their hand in any usable way. The weird thing about glove anesthesia is, first of all, these people didn't have any nerve damage, but even if they did, there is no pattern of nerve damage, apparently, that would cause this. So it's sort of an impossible condition on a medical level. So what is going on? Well, most people thought there were two options of what was going on. One option is that the person was just faking. There was nothing wrong with their hand at all, and they were consciously, intentionally faking this disorder. The other was that no, there really is something medical going on, and we just don't understand it. So maybe there is some neurological way this can happen, and we just don't think there is, but it is a real medical condition. And so most people were excluding that second option. They're saying, I don't think that's true, and therefore they were assuming the person was faking. Freud suggested a third alternative. And this is really the birth of clinical psychology, as he does so. The symptom is reflecting some force of which the patient is not consciously aware. So he wanted to say it's not a medical thing. It is sort of like faking, although it's not really faking because the person is not intentionally doing anything, but rather there's some other force within this person that's making this happen, and the person themselves is not consciously aware of it. Unconscious forces shaping our behavior, of course, what Freud really became known for at the time. And so this was his third alternative. This was the path he started to follow initially. He worked with Brewer, another very famous psychologist, and played with hypnosis a little bit. And they had this very famous patient, Anna O, who had this sort of glove anesthesia and had a number of other things, and they found that with hypnosis, sometimes they could talk through some of these issues, and in fact the symptomology would get better. So it seemed to Brewer like hypnosis might be a way of somehow releasing people of this force, whatever it was, and this release was called catharsis somehow, and Freud started playing with that. He started using hypnosis, but he ultimately didn't like it. And the textbook tells a story. I've heard a number of different stories, but the one the textbook suggests is what he found is that people would behave in bizarre ways when they were hypnotized or when they just came out of hypnosis sometimes. And he didn't like, he felt that the interaction, so it talks about one person who actually hugged him at some point, and he felt that it didn't make for professional sorts of interactions. So ultimately he ended up rejecting hypnosis as an approach to kind of getting at what this force is, and instead went to his very classic situation we know of sitting at the end of a couch where he could see the patient, but the patient couldn't see them. So the patient was just talking to the air, but Freud could still observe the patient and, of course, listen to the patient well. And he would talk to them a lot. So we'll get to that. But the Freudian psychoanalysis is what we would now call a talk therapy. Let me just hold off and come right back there. But even at this early stage, the suggestion is that there's some sort of pent-up energy inside this person, and that's what's causing the symptom. And if we could release that energy, the person would be better. I just want to highlight that kind of idea is what we sometimes now call the medical model or the medical approach. And what I mean by that is, imagine you have a flu. Well, a flu is a virus, and that virus that you have gives rise to symptoms. And so you might go to a doctor and say, I have a fever, I have a headache, etc. Those are the symptoms. If you really want to get rid of the symptoms, you can give people something that will reduce the symptoms. But to most medical people, that's not the right way to get rid of this situation. The right way is to kill the virus. All right, the virus is causing the symptoms. If you just treat the symptoms, the virus is still there. And so if you really want to get rid of the symptoms, you have to get to the internal cause. And so for Freud, things like love anesthesia were symptoms. And he didn't get too excited about the symptoms. He wanted to get at the cause, the underlying cause, which he felt were these this pent-up energy. Now, what exactly did we mean by that pent-up energy? It kind of changed over time. So as his theories developed, and they developed over a period of time, he started emphasizing sexual and aggressive motivations. And I want to explain to you why, because I think it's very important, and it becomes something that others react to later. It's absolutely one of the reasons Freud became so well known and his work became so well known, because he lived in a Victorian era when people did not talk about sex openly at all. And so the fact that he was talking about sex not only openly, but making sensational claims like children sexually desiring their opposite sex parent, we'll get to down here, that was like, what is this guy talking about? So he was saying things nobody has ever said out loud, and that attracted a lot of attention and people got interested. So he often felt that the stereotypical cause of people's issues was something that happened at their childhood, and this is a stereotype of Freud. Tell me about your childhood. What was your mother and father like, etc. And so he often thought that something sexual might happen in someone's childhood. It could be a form of sexual abuse, for example, that happens to somebody that they're not quite ready to consciously deal with. And as a result, I'm going to jump down to here, they get this sensor in action. So Freud imagined that there's a sensor that can decide what gets into your conscious mind. Think of it like a bouncer, at a club or something, and that bouncer decides who gets in. And if we have some experience that we're not able to deal with emotionally or psychologically, this bouncer simply keeps it out of our awareness. You're not getting in there. But imagine this thing wants to get into our awareness. So don't think of the bouncer as just saying no. Think of the bouncer saying no, and holding somebody back who's trying to get in. And so you have this tension between the bouncer and the information trying to get in. That psychological sort of tension, this causes all this pent-up energy, and that's where the symptoms arise. Okay? And so the only way to get rid of the symptoms is to get that thing into consciousness. You have to somehow overcome the bouncer and let that person have awareness of what actually happened to them. That will release the pent-up energy, and is the beginning, so we call that catharsis, this release of the energy, and that's the beginning of a healing process, when you can get at the actual cause. So a lot of the talk in the talk therapy was intended to try to get at this initial cause of the psychological tension. Now the problem or the challenge, I guess, of this therapy is the mind is actively trying to prevent this information from getting into conscious awareness, right? That's what the sensor is doing. So you can't simply just ask somebody, you can't just say, I think you were sexually abused. weren't you? The bouncer will be preventing the information from getting into conscious awareness. So they'll say, no, not that I can remember, no. And so you have to find interesting ways of getting around the bouncer. And a lot of the therapeutic approaches that Freud tried were exactly that, attempts to get at what that true issue was underneath. And he felt you could get that by talking to the patient, working through some stuff, and through some techniques that we'll talk about along the way, some of which people like Jung, for example, advanced and took a step further. Okay, so there's your background. The first thing Freud wrote was called Energy, Project for Scientific Psychology. And we see a lot of this stuff that I've talked to you about in there, along with a couple of other sort of specifics. So let's just go through this. So this, Freud imagined this energy is accumulating in the person, and that this energy can make us desire certain objects that would reduce the tension. So there's all sorts of energy in Freud's system. There's the bouncer one I told you about, but there's other motivational energy. And now this is where the sex and aggression comes in, because Freud thought we have all these needs and desires, but many of our needs and desires can be met in socially acceptable ways. We have a need for food, and if we don't have enough food, we feel hungry. And if we feel hungry, well, and imagine you're sitting in the classroom feeling hungry and you have a chocolate bar in your pocket. You can pull out that chocolate bar, you can unwrap it, you can eat it, and probably nobody will look at you as though you're doing anything strange. It's completely accepted by society. If you're sitting in class and you're feeling a little cold, you might feel a desire for warmth. Maybe you put on a sweater. You can do that in front of everybody, and perfectly cool, socially acceptable, nobody gets upset. If that person sitting beside you is annoying and you feel a desire to elbow them in the face to shut them up, you can't do that. You cannot do that in a socially acceptable way. If you elbow them in the face, if you act aggressive towards them in front of everybody else, people will say, hey, what are you doing? You can't do that. So aggression, you cannot just act on your desires. Now, do I have to go to the sex world? Yeah, we can. If that person beside you is very attractive to you and you would really like to fondle part of their body because you think it would feel fantastic, you can't do that. That's called sexual abuse of various sorts, and we've heard all about this kind of thing in these days. So some people still do things, right? But you're not allowed to in a socially acceptable way. And so that's why Freud thought they were interesting, that these things, sexual and aggressive desires, were more complex. In order to satisfy them, you had to find ways that were socially acceptable, and that can be a challenge. And so that can lead to this energy where you have this desire for something that's sexual or aggressive, but you cannot just act on it. And so what do? Well, he says there's a couple of things that happen. So primary processes can cause a person to hallucinate that object. So you can imagine elbowing that person in the face. You can imagine fondling that person in a way that you would like. So we might call this fantasy. We have a fantasy world to kind of live out some of these desires, and that would be one of the roles that fantasy would provide for us, is a way of kind of getting some of that energy out without offending others. But he said there's also secondary processes that really want to find ways to gratify these wishes in the real world, but within the demands and constraints of reality. And so, maybe if you would really like to be fondling that person beside you, then the right first step is to introduce yourself nicely as a gentleman and in a friendly way. And, maybe if things progress in a certain way, you'll eventually be able to fulfill your desires. But you have to do this in a way that fits within reality. And so based on this, he came up with these two ideas called the pleasure principle and the reality principle. And he said primary processes follow the pleasure principle. They're just about giving you immediate pleasure. Secondary processes follow the reality principle, which is trying to get some form of pleasure or release of that desire, but doing so in ways that fit with the constraints of reality. So sometimes we have to accept reality if we want things to happen in the real world, and that's where secondary processes kind of hung out. Okay, now we're back to this bouncer again. Trauma results in energy devoted to repressing the traumatic memory. So a lot of these secondary processes, just as I described, need to have nothing to do with mental health or trauma. As I described them up to here, elbowing people in the face and fondling people, that's not trauma, that's not mental health, that's just life, right? But sometimes life hits us with certain traumas, and so this would be more like the child that experienced sexual abuse. And that traumatic memory, when you have that traumatic memory and you're trying to repress it, keep it out of consciousness, now the energy cannot be dissipated in the appropriate ways. It can't just leak out in one of these two ways, because you're not conscious of it, for one. Like, imagine the primary process of fantasizing. You have to be aware of what it is you want. But here, the energy, what's causing this energy is unconscious. So it's harder to dissipate it appropriately, and that's when we actually get the symptoms. And so often he linked symptoms to this repression of some traumatic memory, and then psychotherapy is all about overcoming that repression, getting that information past the bouncer into consciousness. Okay? A lot of what I said already, but we're getting some of the terminology and things fleshed out here a little bit. Okay, let's just talk about some of the things Freud's known for, and most of this you've heard in various ways. So, dreams. In trying to, how do you get around the bouncer? Well, Freud thought dreams might do that naturally. So he has this notion that you've seen depicted in a variety of ways, and this is a little differently than how it's depicted in the textbook, but it gives you an idea, where you have, okay, let's do this distinction, by the way, conscious and pre-conscious. So Freud thought there were some things that were almost conscious, that were primed or ready to be conscious. Kind of like, remember back when I told you a while ago that every now and then you kind of look at your mind and you realize it's been thinking things. Not that you've been thinking things, but that it's been thinking things that you weren't even aware of until you shifted your mind there. So what state was that thought in? Like, once you shift your mind there, now it's a really conscious thought, right? You're really aware of it. But what was it before you shifted your mind? Freud did not say it was unconscious. The unconscious is going to be different. The unconscious is going to contain things that cannot or do not get into consciousness. But he thought there was this other state that he called the pre-conscious. And that would be what he would say, with respect to, what state was that thought in before I was consciously aware of it? Well, it was pre-conscious. It was just about conscious. It was just about ready to be conscious. And with a little bit of attention or whatnot, it becomes conscious. So he thought there was, that subtle distinction, but that the much more important distinction was between the unconscious and either of these, and that's where the sensor kind of stands his ground. And so in a normal waking state, the sensor is strong and powerful. And if there's some memory that it doesn't want in consciousness, it prevents it and is able to. But the theory goes, when you're asleep, the sensor is not so strong. He's not paying attention. He's not so much on guard. And therefore, some of these things in your unconscious that are causing this tension and energy can sneak through. The thing is, they don't sneak through in the form they are. How do I say this? So let's say it was a sexually traumatic event that happened to you when you were young, but you're not aware of it. It's not like you will just have a memory of that sexual trauma. It's not like it will sneak into consciousness, as an actual version of that memory. Rather, it gets transformed along the way. It gets sort of symbolized. And so he ended up saying that when we talk about dreams, we can talk about sort of a few levels here. So the manifest content is, if somebody said, what was your dream? And you just describe your dream, that's your dream, okay? But he thought that manifest content had been disguised, had been filtered, and that the real thing that drove all that so-called latent content is underneath, and somehow what we actually see is a symbolic form of it. So he would say things like, okay, if you see tunnels, those are vaginas. I mean, he's all about sex, right? If you see anything cylindrical, that's some sort of phallic kind of thing. That's some sort of penis representation. But everything could represent various things. And so he thought if you could learn to interpret these dreams, if you could learn to look at the manifest content, this is what they said, this is what they saw, this is what they experienced, but what does it actually mean? That by analyzing this appropriately, you could get to the latent content, and that the latent content would reflect that psychological struggle that's going on. So it would give you clues about what's really going on in the unconscious. And so that was one of his modes. He would have people record their dreams as soon as they woke up, and he would analyze their dreams, work through it with them. We come back to free association. Let's stay here with the dreams. Some people have a very simplistic view of this dream analysis, and I've even been able to find things like this online where they say, oh, I don't know, if you dream of feathers, that's the manifest content. What that really is about is loss and failure. I don't know. Feathers, loss. I thought it would be about flying and soaring or something, but it's not. So somebody has gone through and said, this means this, this means this. Freud would say this is ridiculous. That in order to really understand somebody's dreams and to interpret them properly, you had to understand the person. That, that mapping between a symbol and the meaning would be different for every human being. And therefore you needed to really understand the situation, which is why he would talk to his patients for hours, right? He felt you really needed that good understanding of the patient in order to understand what that dream meant to them. So just throwing that out there, it's not as easy as just consulting something like this and analyzing your own dreams. If you want to analyze your own dreams in a Freudian way, you have to read this book and learn how to do it, and it's more complex than that. Now, this is one example of things. There's another example that Freud played with a little bit and really Jung took off with. So it's really Jung that realized the value of this, but I just want to mention it to you to connect some of these ideas to yourself, or ideas to this notion of a repressed content and how you get at it. So one of the things we often think about is, in a Freudian situation, is that they would often say, tell me the first word that comes to mind when I say things. So let's say you're a therapist, and you're starting to believe that somebody's uncle had sexually abused them when they were young. So now what you might say is, say the first word that comes to mind when I say certain things. And you might say, I don't know, tree, and they say green, and you say wall, and they say hard, and you say, I don't know, driveway, and they say car, and you say uncle. And that's the one that matters to you. And one of two things could be important. Originally in Freud, he was interested in things like, do you say something that sounds evil or dark? So when it's uncle, do you say scary, intimidating, something like that, which might imply that he's sort of a dark character in your life, right? And that might confirm the suspicion Freud had. Or in other cases, and Jung really kind of focused on this, it's about the time it takes you to respond. So maybe it was like tree, green, wall, hard, driveway, car, uncle, blue. I don't know. But the fact that, it took you a while might suggest that the sensor is kind of kicking in there, and messing with you. So that's the kind, they really thought you had to go digging for the truth into the unconscious somehow, and you might even have to trick the unconscious into revealing what's going on. And that's, again, why you had to talk and work through things. It was more like detective work than many therapies are now, for sure. Okay, so you have a sense. Okay, so that's all interesting. A little bit about his therapy. He also became, I mentioned this to you before, that he talked about things, sexual things, when nobody was talking about them. And not only did he talk about sexual things, he said what many people thought were kind of crazy things about sexual things. Like, he talked about it like, wow. And a lot of that came from this part of his work. He was interested in how the mind develops from being very young to being older. And he described what he called his stages of psychosexual development. He thought sexual development and psychological development were connected. Now, the first thing to understand about Freud is when he uses the word sexual, he uses it in a very broad way. You know, most of us, when we think of the word sexual, we think of certain sex acts, and we would call those sexual acts. For Freud, it's almost better to think of the term sensual, and to really think of that term, sensual, something that produces a sensation, a pleasing sensation. You know, and so of course, you know, sexual things can do that. But again, you know, let's consider some of these. So Freud thought the first stage was what he called the oral stage. And the idea here is the child and the libido, which is the driving force Freud called it, is really looking for sensual pleasures. And the focus of those sensual pleasures originally are on the mouth, tongue, and lips. And so it wants to feel sensual things here. And this is this notion of breastfeeding, basically. So what he would say is when a child is breastfeeding, the child really enjoys it. It's a very pleasurable experience for the child. He would say it's a sexual experience. But I think most of us would buy in that it might be a sensual experience. We can understand how you know that process of suckling a breast could feel good for your mouth, tongue, and lips. And so he said that's what they were focused on. But then some critical thing happens somewhere. At some point, the mother says, enough is enough of this breastfeeding. And so at some point you get weaned off of this breastfeeding, you know, or it could be formula too, right? Which is still the same sensual experience. And so at this point, the child has to be ready to move on to an extent and get over this stage of things. I'll talk about becoming fixated in a moment. He would say if you had trouble moving past this, if you had trouble probably with the weaning process in the beginning, but even if you successfully wean, you still might be a little hung up at this level, this fixedness. And if you are, you show oral tendencies like smoking or overeating, or maybe you become a professor and spend half your life talking or singing because you're a mouth kind of person and you're still partly a mouth kind of person. So maybe if I'm guilty of being fixated anywhere, maybe this is my stage. I can explain why I spend all my time talking. But his normal notion is you get past that, and then the anus becomes the focus of the libido. Why the anus? Well, you know, up until this time, when you get to 1 to 3, up until before that, you had a diaper on, and the general attitude of society was, hey, if you have to pee, if you have to poop, just go ahead and do it. Just do it. And then at some point, your parents say, hey, hang on, we're not cool with this anymore. We're changing the rules. We don't want you to have that freedom to just pee or poo anytime you want. We want you to learn how to do it in a grown-up way, which means, you know, going to a washroom and toilet training. And so this means taking control of, you know, of peeing and pooing, basically. You know how you do it. It's hard to say these things in any nicer way than that. But it's also seen by Freud as a real challenge. This is when the child really has to conform to the demands of society and stop just doing whatever it wants. And some children have a lot of trouble making it past that stage, and Freud would say for some people they never completely do. And if you had trouble getting past this stage, or you're still a little fixated at this, you're going to be focused on things like cleanliness, orderliness. You know, we call somebody, wow, you're really anal, right? What's that mean? It means they're focused on details, right? Toilet training is about cleanliness. Above all else, it's about not having to change diapers anymore. It's a much cleaner way of eliminating waste. And so, yeah, the notion is somebody still fixated here is really a detail-oriented person, and we call those people anal now, anally fixated sometimes. Okay, you make it through toilet training, everything's good. Now you reach this phallic stage where the emphasis becomes more on the genitals themselves, the sexual organs. This is where theoretically children start to kind of think about the difference between males and females. They start to realize what the biological difference is, what they have or don't have that the other gender has or doesn't have, and they get a little focused on this, and they get a little focused on this gender disparity. And this is the stage where Freud would say this is where young boys become focused on their mothers as a sort of potential sexual partner, which doesn't make any sense when you think of a 4 or 5 year old. But again, don't think of it as the sexual act. Think of it more as the desire to be, very close to that person. I would describe it that way. So the idea Freud had is that young girls want to be very close to their father and may even feel jealous of their mother for the attention that the mother gets from the father. And similarly, young boys could become fixated on their mother and become jealous of their father for the attention he gets from the mother. So it's kind of like, I want mom for myself. I'm the boy, she's the girl in our family, and you're another boy, but I want the girl. And so the idea is that the children have to resolve this. They have to learn somewhere that they can't just possess the opposite sex parent. It's not theirs to have. And they're just working through this whole issue. And at some point, roughly by about 6 years of age, they get this more realistic attitude, that the parents are together as a couple, and both are available to them, but in a parenting kind of way, right? And so the claim is, if children didn't get through this stage very well, then they have deviancy. They just become troublemakers, but they also have trouble in their sexual patterns and sexual lives. So if somebody came to Freud and suggested that they had, problems, sexual problems of some sort that were bothering them, he would start to wonder whether there wasn't some fixation going on at the phallic stage. And he would be looking at this sort of period of their life to try to figure out what might be going on. Okay. Latency, 6 to 12. This period in between where there's really no focus of the libido per se, but you're developing defense mechanisms. We're going to talk about the defense mechanisms when we talk about Anna Freud a little more, because a lot of that was her work, actually. And so this is more a period of learning how to dissipate energy in, sort of that reality principle way, in ways that kind of allow it to dissipate. So we'll get to that in a little bit. So for now, let's just say this is when the defense mechanisms are forming. There isn't really, he didn't talk about being fixated at this stage or anything that happens with that. He then says, okay, and sorry, this one is actually called the phallic stage, the 3 to 6, because now we have the genital stage. In both cases, the focus is on the genitals. But this is now a very different kind of focus. So this is a child that's now reaching puberty, and so obviously the genitals become a sort of focus then as well. But this child is reaching full sexual maturity. That's the kind of challenge of this stage, I guess. And so now the sexual interest, the sensual interest, is more towards opposite gender but same age others, right? And so this is when you start to reach full sexual maturity. You start to kind of desire people your age, etc. And that, now, of course, in Freud's world, there was no homosexuality. He never talked about anything like that at all. And so he always talks as though everything's just male-female dichotomy, in a sort of traditional way, and that's just how he talks. So if all these stages are successfully completed, then the person should be sexually mature and mentally healthy. So if you can get through all of these stages, you're good. But here's his migration story. What he said is, rather than imagining a single person going through this, let's think of it like a peoples that had to leave one geographical location and move to another far away one. But as they're making this journey from the first location to the last location, some of the group stop along the way and stay there. So maybe you just make a first stop. Maybe it's 4 days to get to where you want to go, but at the end of the first day you make a stop, and then you decide to go again. But some people say, no, I'm just going to stay here. I'm good. Thanks. Off you go. And so at the second stop, you then go again, and some people say, no, I'm just going to stay here. So that's sort of how Freud thought of it, that you could have, that part of you could get hung up at these various stages or fixated on these various stages because you had trouble meeting the challenge of that stage. And if you do get hung up at a various stage, then that's when you show some of these fixation issues. And so this is, one of the famous things I like to say about Freud every now and then is he had the best pickup line of anybody, in the sense he would be able to say, yes, I've been watching you very carefully from afar. I've been watching you do some things that tell me things about you that even you do not know. So that's a pretty cool line, right? Can I tell you about you? Can I tell you things about you that you don't even know? How can you say no to that? Yeah. What do you know about me that I don't know? I'd like to hear this. And so that's, what he thought is by looking at people and watching what they do. So Freud himself, for example, smoked cigars constantly. If he saw someone smoking cigars constantly, he would say, okay, you've got a bit of an oral fixation. Something you did not quite get through that step quite well, and part of you is still there. That's why we're seeing this oral tendency. Smoking a cigar would be a very oral tendency. Yeah. Think we're good there? I think we're good there. All right, let's go on. There's just never a dull moment with Freud. Everything's kind of interesting. Okay, now, in Freud's model, we've kind of done this already: conscious, preconscious, unconscious. That was, think of that pyramid, and there was the bouncer in the middle here. But Freud also came up with these other parts, components of our psyche, of our personality, and ended up describing things in terms of these components in ways that were kind of cool. So if we start with, notice where it is in the unconscious, the id. Id, by the way, in German is it. It is the it. Within us. It is the beast. It is the primitive part of us. It is the part that has desires and wants those satisfied now. Something we call immediate gratification. And so the id could be the thing that has you look at that person on the left and says, I really want to grab their body. I really want to fondle some part of them. And that's the id going, do it. Yeah, I want to do it. I want to do it right now. I want to do it right now. And so if it were the only thing that you possess, you would just do stuff and you get in trouble all the time, right? But let's just imagine, we'll keep with that situation. So there you are, and the id is saying, I want that person beside me right now. The superego it's described in various ways. One of the ways it's described is it represents the person everybody else wants you to be, or that society wants you to be. What I prefer is it's the best version of you. It's the version you would like people to think of you as. So you want people to think you're honest, hardworking, trustworthy, all those sorts of positive values. And that's all represented in the superego. So it's this representation of the best possible you, the you that you would like to show your future spouse's parents. You would like them to see you as this glowing sort of hero. And that's with the superego. It's a representation of that. So within us, we have this little it that just wants everything and wants it now. We have this superego that's like, the saint version of us. And in between those two suckers is the ego. And it's the ego's challenge to try to balance this. And the ego works with the reality principle. And so the ego is the part of us that's trying to give the it something like what it wants, but to do so in ways that fit with what society says is a good, positive way to be. And so, I said earlier that one option might be, if you really like that person to your left, to begin talking to them, to strike up a friendship or whatever. So this is the kind of thing the ego would say, no, you cannot just reach over and grab that person. If you want to really grab that person, if you want to fondle them in certain ways, there's a path for that in the reality principle, and that path involves chatting first, getting to know them, hoping they like you, going out on a date, goodness knows what, and etc. And so, it's the referee that's trying to find ways to give the it what it wants, but also conforming to the super ego. And so this is this nice sort of three-way thinking of things where the ego is the sort of problem solver within that whole structure. Okay. And that's all I have on Freud for now. So I'm going to stop there for now. I'm going to come back at the very end of this and talk about why Freud is as controversial a topic as a person as he is. But for now, let me just leave you with that. That's the ideas, and that's what he said. Okay, cool. Thanks.